Hello, my name is Adam Sweeting, and I'm the chair of the Division of Humanities at the College of General Studies. And we're here to talk with you a little bit today about the interdisciplinary teaching experience and learning experience here at the College of General Studies. One of the great joys of teaching here and learning here is the opportunity to engage in some very high-level, challenging and interesting and quite relevant interdisciplinary investigations of contemporary and historical issues. And we're just going to give you a taste of a class that we recently did, the three of us. It was ostensibly in my humanities class, but my colleagues, who you will meet in a minute or two, joined us, and we led a very active discussion that focused on the work of Edward O. Wilson, the great contemporary. He's quite elderly at this point, but he was active most of the 20th century, specializing in ants. And he's written quite a bit on the biological origins of human behavior, of human emotions, and particularly relevant for my class, on human ethics. So what we've done over the course of the year in humanities is we've explored the relationship between the individual and the community. We've explored how different thinkers, going back to Plato and Aristotle and Thomas Hobbes and Confucius, have examined the ways human emotions such as love, hate, jealousy, empathy, greed, competition, compassion, how these forces shape and influence human behavior. And so when we get to the 20th century, late 20th century, with the work of Wilson, we look at his biological studies of ants. And Wilson began his career as an ant specialist. And here we have an image of an ant colony. This was in Brazil. And this is from a scene from his film of Ants and Men. And you see here this enormous, complex structure that was built by ants, these tiny little creatures with no brain, a tiny, tiny brain. And they managed to work collaboratively as almost as an organism unto itself to build this structure and live collaboratively with thousands and thousands and thousands of individuals within the community. And then we have this teeming colony, Manhattan, which was also built by thousands and thousands of individuals over the scope of hundreds of years. And sometimes these people were working collaboratively, sometimes they're working as individuals. And Wilson gets into the relationship between these ideas: cooperation, working together, and what that requires, and also the very strong human impulse to sort of strike out on one's own, to be an individual, to not cooperate, to perhaps cheat, to perhaps lie their way to the top. And there may be biological and evolutionary reasons for these types of behavior that we begin to explore in this interdisciplinary class that focuses on the work of E.O. Wilson, drawing on his work on ants, but also he talks about dance, about sports, about couples coming together, about the joys of watching and listening to an orchestra, and how all of these behaviors might have a biological origin and an evolutionary origin. And his primary statement, I think, is relevant, that if we're going to understand human nature, if we're going to understand the humanities, we have to get at the evolution and the biology of the human animal. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Lavallee, who will tell a little bit about how her class draws on the work of Wilson and some of these ideas.
So I'm Professor Lavallee, Professor Kari Lavallee, and the Natural Sciences and Mathematics, and I'm the acting chair this year. So I've had the pleasure of working with the other chairs on this particular class that we did together. But in our sophomore level courses, we first explore ecology and communities, and then we tie that into how those communities evolved to be a unit and how evolution works. And then we finally talk about human evolution as well. And then our second semester, we talk about how humans are radically altering the earth and these ecosystems and what impact that has not only on the ecosystems, but also on humans themselves. So I come at this from a biological perspective. Uh, I am a fan of E.O. Wilson. He's one of the first biologists who ever tried to pin a biological basis for some of our behaviors, both good and bad. Um, and unfortunately, at the time that he did this in the 1970s, he was richly criticized for his ideas, but it turns out he's basically correct. So one of the interesting things about animals that cooperate, if you look at something like the social insects, people have known for centuries about social insects and how bizarre they were, in that social insects have a division of labor in their colonies. There's a queen who gives birth to all of the offspring, and then she has helpers who take care of those offspring and raise them. And she also has soldiers who protect the nest, who go out and forage and fight other colonies, and sometimes make slaves of other colonies or other species. Um, so it's a very interesting animal phenomena, and we don't see it in many species. Primarily, we're talking about social insects, although there is one social mammal that acts like this, the naked mole rat. And there's one female who's a queen, and she pretty much, by being very barbaric, controls the entire colony. And then there's also one crustacean that does this as well. It's a snapping shrimp that lives in a sponge, and it also has this kind of social structure. So this is fairly unusual. The interesting thing about humans is that we're coming out of a group of primates, and primates by and large have a society where there tends to be one or two males present in the society, and then there's lots of juvenile males, but not adult males. And then there are many, many females. And the dominant male tends to control access to those females. If the subordinate males who are present do him favors, they might get the opportunity to mate with those females. But by and large, most adult males are kicked out of their natal group, and they have to go and find their own colony of females to take over. Um, we're unusual in that we're a primate where males can live at very high densities. So what changed in humans that allowed for this? Well, it turns out two things changed. One, females became cryptic in when they were in estrus. So males can't actually tell when we are ready to mate and get pregnant. In other species, females come into estrus once or twice a year, and every single male in the society knows exactly when that's going to happen. And then they all get bent out of shape and start fighting each other for access to the females. In human societies, that is not the case. Human males, by and large, have no idea when females are receptive to be mated with and become pregnant. And the other thing that happened is that males reduce their testosterone levels, which means that they're less likely to fight with each other, even if they knew something like when a female was in estrus and receptive. So this has allowed for humans to live at really different densities than other primates and other mammals overall. And it's a really interesting aspect here. Now, both E.O. Wilson and Darwin use different words to describe why this could happen. Certainly, Darwin, talking about natural selection, he basically phrased it as a very selfish process where you should be out to reproduce on your own and get your own genes in the next generation. E.O. Wilson and Darwin talked about the fact that there could be kin selection where you might be able to cooperate with other organisms, with other conspecific animals of your own species, if you are highly related to them. And we call that kin selection today. But even humans are different in that regard, in that we could certainly be much more cooperative towards our own kin, like our brothers or our sisters or our aunts or our uncles or our parents, but we could also be more cooperative with people that we consider to be the same as us, our tribes, for example. And that leads us into interesting concepts within the social sciences. And I will hand this over to Professor Mackey, who will explain more about that.
Well, thank you. I'm John Mackey. I'm the chair of the Social Sciences Division here at CGS. And as you can probably gather from my colleagues' comments, at CGS, we like our students to ask big questions. And that's one of the reasons why I love collaboratively teaching about the film of Ants and Men and teaching about E.O. Wilson with my colleagues, Professor LaValle and Professor Sweeting, because Wilson's concerned not only with ants, of course, but with questions about the ways that humans too organize ourselves into functional societies. And he's concerned about the ways that our vast capacity to cooperate exists in tension with our tendencies toward tribalism. These are questions of tremendous interest to us in the social sciences and a good example of the close links between the approaches of humanists, social scientists, and natural scientists. And E.O. Wilson is also concerned about the destruction of the biosphere and threats to biodiversity, which raises questions about whether our foreign policy is sustainable. We all today question whether our way of life in various ways is sustainable. Social Science 202, one of our sophomore courses, examines US foreign policy since World War II. And so working with my students, we try to raise questions about the way that our foreign policy may or may not be sustainable in the long run. It's deeply connected to these kinds of questions. So for example, international trade is a foreign policy issue that we speak about frequently. And of course, it has a tremendous impact on the environment. I'd also say that in various ways, military issues are connected to sustainability. The US Defense Department has a massive global infrastructure and a network of over 800 bases. And it uses a tremendous amount of energy and has a huge carbon footprint. The US Department of Defense is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. The US military releases more carbon into the atmosphere than 140 countries. So even though the US federal government in general has had a skeptical response at best to questions about climate change, the US military is currently engaged in programs designed to cut its carbon emissions, including development of grid-level battery storage and alternative vehicles. And this is a question very much on the radar, so to speak, of the military. Our military forces have also been deployed numerous times in places that are considered of vital national interest because of the presence of fossil fuels in those places. The Persian Gulf region would be perhaps chief among those areas. The US military then, both in its institutional practices and in its goals and its deployment, is inseparable from questions and conversations about fossil fuel resources, climate change, and sustainability. Melting sea ice, another international issue of interest here. Melting sea ice caused by climate change is going to transform the Arctic, opening up new shipping lanes. This is already creating tensions between the nations whose territory borders the Arctic Circle, and it seems certain to be a growing point of contention between the United States and Russia in coming years. Climate change is also projected to produce political instability related to conflicts over dwindling freshwater resources, or possibly other resources, as well as sharply increasing numbers of climate refugees. Rising sea levels and catastrophic droughts and storms will very likely contribute to refugee crises for the foreseeable future. These issues will be key foreign policy and military problems in the coming century and are very much on the US military radar. And so these are the kinds of questions that have to do with sustainability, the environment, resources, and are connected to the kinds of issues Professor Sweeting and Professor LaValle are also bringing up in their courses.
Which brings me back to E.O. Wilson, who was the sort of fulcrum which brought this discussion together on the tensions between the individual, the community, tribalism. And we are now in a moment in our history where we need cooperation. We have these major global problems and challenges such as climate change and the current pandemic, which we're all experiencing today, that are going to require unprecedented levels of cooperation across the globe. And the students coming out of this course and this sequence of courses that we have at the College of General Studies and in this interdisciplinary environment will be prepared to ask those big questions. Will be prepared to examine them from an intellectual and perhaps abstract level, but also right directly to a policy. How do we balance these things and these challenges in our current world? And so Wilson is just one lens into these sorts of discussions that we can have at the College of General Studies. And we hope we gave you a taste of what happens here at CGS. And we look forward to welcoming you all to campus come next January. So thank you very much.